Wait for it, and we're live. And this time they made me wait for it for real. There was like 6 seconds where we were just hanging before it started recording. But hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to let our guest, Mr. Richard Nell, introduce himself to our listeners and viewers at home.
Well, first I have to congratulate you on your intro. I feel like I'm on some sort of radio broadcast program now.
Yeah, fake it till you make it, you know?
I'm Richard Nell. I am a fantasy author. I've written, I guess, primarily a epic trilogy. Some people think of it as dark. I just thought of it as historical. I'm a history nerd. I also write harem, and I've got 10 or 11 books in that genre. And I've been doing this for about a decade now, which is a bit hard to believe. But yeah, that's me.
Okay, so are you a huge history nerd and geography nerd? I noticed a map behind you.
Oh, yeah. Well, you can't separate history and geography.
Absolutely not, because one influences the other. All right, so does that mean when you write, you actually like make maps for your worlds?
Oh, yeah. So there's a map for the Ash and Sand Trilogy, King's Paradise, first book. And I have to be a little sneaky about it because it's in the time sort of Iron Age philosophy, technology. And so they don't know that everybody has an understanding of the world. So there's different continents, and I don't have it all mapped out for the reader right off the bat.
Okay, that makes sense because you're limited to what you could walk in a day roughly. A lot of people, unless they were nomadic, they didn't move around a lot in post agriculture, and those that were nomadic still, I mean, they only went but so far. They followed the herds essentially. So
Yeah, well, there's oceans, so it's like, is there a new world? Is there continents? What's the deal? So that's
there be
part of it.
monsters. That's what we learned in history class.
Yeah.
So did you do the maps yourself or did you hire them out?
I did it myself. I'm sure, I'm no grand expert at it, but I used some software and sort of fudged around, and it looks okay. But I probably should redo it at some point.
Yeah, I do love maps. I actually, because I trained, obviously my military experience was the infantry, and we do lots of sand tables, which are like 3-dimensional terrain representations where you plan a battle.
Oh, yeah.
You've seen those in dioramas and stuff too. And so I plan all of that out in advance. And then if I'm writing a series where I don't have like a world map when it comes to a terrain map, I generally will subcontract that out because if you write your own map, it's too easy to make every battle Thermopylae or the Alamo, right? Like given you're in Texas right now. But it's more authentic, I think, if you get the map and then you plan your tactics accordingly because history has taught us not all the battles happen where you want them to be. Like those poor English knights at Bannockburn. Like, I mean, come on. Like
battles are rarely where you want them to be, I would say.
Unless you're really, really smart and on the defense.
Yeah. It's like, everybody it's like negotiating a contract, Usually both people come out a little unhappy.
That's how you know you did it right. And in a battle, if you come out alive, you did it right. Even if you lost. If you don't die, that's a good day. So, all right. So before we get started, we do have to do the religion question. So are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
All right. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Easy, Firefly.
Okay. What is it about Firefly that speaks to you?
It's probably the realism, sort of you'll see that's a theme in my work. I like to ground fantasy in a realistic world where everything else kind of makes sense. I've always hated stories where you've got this intricate magic system. I don't want to pick on anyone in particular, but a very detailed magic system it's almost like science in a culture that doesn't have plumbing. You know what I mean? That's always annoyed me. So I like Firefly because it has that sort of sense of realism. You really feel like this is a universe that makes sense. And it's got that small, really get to know these characters really well. It's funny, but it's also serious. It's this perfect blend. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I think if you're going to have magic, you have to assume that magic would be treated like technology. So what we have, like, okay, we got a microwave. Well, you don't need a microwave if you can, glow a magic orb around it and heat it like that. Like you just substitute one for the other, because technology and magic are solutions to problems, right? So as long as you're creative enough, you can make anything work.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. Like, but we also, part of that stems from most people not truly understanding history. We had just assumed they were poor, dirty morons who didn't know which way was up. And we find out that, they were kind of smart in their own way, like maybe different kind of smart than us, because it was more, earth centric, because they lived off the land, but they weren't idiots. They didn't do things that didn't work.
Yeah. No, of course. Well, and to me, magic, just like technology, as I'm, in the Ash and Sand series, is definitely, you'll experience this. Magic is kind of a continuum. It's a project. So, you have some technology, but you don't have robots. You don't have microwaves. Maybe you just have, but you've got more than people who had in the Bronze Age. And so you don't know everything, and you make things up, and people might have it wrong. And so that what they might think makes this magic work is not true. And then somebody else comes along and says, no, it's actually this other thing that you didn't even understand you were doing, and can, take it another level higher.
Yeah, and you see that a lot, especially with fantasy, with this idea that like the armor was super heavy and they could barely move or whatever. Like no, like swords, shields, like they didn't carry those if they didn't work. They didn't build castles if they served no purpose, and when they gunpowder defeated the castle, they stopped building them. And so I think when you get more practical with it, there's a deeper, richer world there to explore, which makes the story even better.
Yeah, which this again back to Firefly. Sort of, you can just see that they're trying to show you these multiple cultures and how things have evolved, the way they're using different languages, and anyway, it's well done.
Yeah. So because we're polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, Game of Thrones, The Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia.
You're going to detect the theme here, but Game of Thrones, again, easy win because of that same sense of grounding it in a sort of more realistic world where you can just feel the tension. You can feel the characters are going to die, that things go wrong for people, that it does not always work out for these heroes or these characters, and that the heroes have dark sides, the villains have good qualities, and it's just such a more rich, sort of full experience compared to most of the fantasy that came before it. Obviously, there's exceptions, but
so yeah. You don't think the world of the Wheel of Time was deep enough? I think he went pretty deep in the lore.
He went deep into the lore. I'll give you that, but again, it just doesn't have the same realism as Song of Ice and Fire. It's more of that classic. I don't want to say Tolkien, but just it has a much more shallow feeling in most of the human dimensions, if that makes sense.
Was it because it was too clean when it comes to the life, living and such?
Exactly, that's part of it. Yeah.
Okay, that's fair. One of the crying shames of adulthood is we stop asking each other the important questions. So we're bringing that back here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Richard, what is your favorite dinosaur?
That is a tough question. I think I got to go with the T-Rex classic. They probably have bigger ones now. I don't know, but I remember when I was a kid, it was sort of, it scared me. And there was this museum we had where they had this sort of fake T-Rex set up, and it roared at you as you came down to the sort of the basement of this museum. And it just, every single time, I just felt my heart like pounding in my chest. But I loved it. He's the king of the dinosaur world. Though I'm not sure if that's true anymore. There might be some like.
I think there are dinosaurs that are bigger that we found proof of. And the weird thing is we pictured sort of like Godzilla covered in scales, and then to find out maybe he was covered in fur, so it's just like a danger chicken. It's
feathers or something.
Yeah, with the feathers. Like I'm having trouble wrapping the monster of my childhood around the idea that it was covered in feathers.
No, I think I'm going to prove sort of the thinking that old people can't change that well. I'm like, no, not my T-Rex.
Yeah, I say that about Pluto too. Pluto's still a planet, dang it.
That's right.
It'll always be a planet in my book. My favorite, though, is I saw, so we have in Hampton, the Air and Space Museum, and I was taking the kids around it last year, and they had this lady that was also touring with her kids, and she had a NASA shirt. It says, "Dear NASA, I was big enough for your mother, signed Pluto. I just thought, like, I need that shirt in my life.
Yeah. Classic.
Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, things change, and sometimes it's not that I can't change; it's I don't always want to.
That's right. Unless it's sort of useful or important, it's like, well, I'm good.
So, because we are civilized human beings here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, we are no longer knuckle dragging troglodytes. Coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
Coffee. I'll drink it black. I don't nothing too fancy. If you put some cream in there, that's fine.
Okay. Because I know you are originally from Canada, even though you're living in Texas now, I do have to ask you about your stance on war crimes. Are you ready for this, sir? This is the important question.
Okay, I'm ready.
Poutine, yes or no? I contend that it's a war crime every time.
Wait, what?
Poutine. You know, the crap you ruin fries with.
Well, yes. As a Canadian, I'm not Eastern Canadian.
Okay.
Just to be clear, Americans don't really comprehend there's different kinds of Canadians usually, which I don't blame you at all. But I'm a Western Canadian, and so anybody who's sort of Ontario or further to me, it's sort of like small town mentality. I sort of have to spit every time I mention them. And if you get far enough into the French speaking, like sort of Quebec, which is kind of the poutine people,
right?
They're basically
poutine people. I like it.
Yeah, I mean, I would help someone from like North Dakota invade Quebec. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Western Canadians are this close to Western Americans, but we're this close to Quebec Canadian.
Okay.
So yes, war crime. I'm with you.
Outstanding. We're probably going to get hate mail, but it's okay. I'm here for it.
That's fine. I'm a Canadian. I'm the one who's going to get the hate mail.
Yeah, and I've worked with a friend of the show who is just a personal friend of mine. He's in my writing accountability group, and I work with him a lot. Mostly we pester each other to make sure we don't slack. But I've noticed that English-speaking Canadians, even those that it's their only language, you almost speak like you're bilingual. So like some of his syntax is just off. And it's weird what growing up in a culture where it's expected that you be not just bilingual, but bilingual with two specific languages. Some of it's like, oh, I bet that's from the French side of the Canadian English.
It's weird.
With the verb choices and the spellings.
Yeah, there's the French connection, and partially it's sort of more of a British English than American, and so we have way more U's in our spelling, and it's just a bit different. And Americans are always like, wait, what is it guy from Australia? What is this?
Yeah, that's one of the things I've heard from Australians speaking about just, Americans speaking to any of the Commonwealth countries. It's like two countries separated by the Casamine Gulf of a common language.
Yeah,
But when you think about the differences in the way we speak in, say, Texas versus New England, although I think in the internet age that's slowly probably fading.
Yeah, I'm living here in West Texas, and I'm just
no, sir. You've got to say by God, West Texas. I think it's required in the state constitution.
Okay, well, my mistake. I'm a foreigner, remember, and I'm amazed at how many different accents. Also, people don't give a shit. They really don't care what your accent is here. They don't care where you're from. It's like, well, you're here now. It's something.
So, what brought you from Canada to the warmth of Texas?
Well, partly the weather, that's for sure. My wife is a nurse, and so she got a job at a hospital here. And
okay.
Every 5 years or so, I just like to say, yeah, let's just pick it up and change everything. And I've lived in Australia. I've lived in different places in Canada. And so I thought, yeah, why not? And we picked up the kids, and we came all the way down to Texas. So I can work from anywhere as a writer, obviously, so it doesn't make any difference to me.
And your kids are going to get memories of growing up all over the globe, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, there's places I don't want to go, that's for sure. My wife is from the Philippines originally, so probably at some point we'll spend a few years there with her family and so on. But we have to decide when. And I'm sure it'll get harder the older we get.
Yeah. The standard of living might be more difficult for writing because you need Wi-Fi at that point. And if you're not near one of the big cities, I know it's rather rural. I just don't know how rural because I've never honestly been there.
Yeah, though these days maybe I can use Elon Musk's Starlink or something. I don't know. I think they probably got them.
In my head, I always revert to calling it Skynet, and I'm like, no, that's not what it's called. Skynet is bad.
Yeah. So who knows what it'll be? I guess by the time I get over there, but yeah, I wouldn't want to be anywhere near a big city in the Philippines. That's for sure.
So is it true that when you move to Texas, when you cross the state border, they issue you a cowboy hat, boots, and a buckle as big as your head? Is that, I've heard the rumor.
It is not true, though. Where I'm from, we're not that different than Texas. We don't have the accent, but we drive trucks, we have guns, we have cowboy boots.
Okay.
We don't typically wear cowboy hats, though. If you go not too far away to Alberta, they do. Um, so yeah, it's the prairies, it's the West. We've got tons of cattle, we've got tons of farmers. My family are all farmers, so it really wasn't a culture shock, let's say, to come to Texas.
So one thing I learned, you get the stereotypes, but when I went to grad school in Pennsylvania, I heard about this concept called Pennsyltucky, which are what the Pennsylvanians call the rednecks that live in Pennsylvania. Kentucky is not too far,
Yeah, yeah.
border-wise. And you realize rednecks or country folk are country folks regardless of what country they live in. It's something about living that close to the land that kind of transcends culture
It
and
really
almost
does.
becomes its own thing.
Yeah.
Um,
And we all have similar things that we hate, like cities, city
yes,
people. So,
the
and
people
we
that
all,
come from the city and then want to vote differently about vote for everything, whatever that vote is that they were fleeing, then they want to impose it on you when they get to you. I'm like, no, you left that for a reason. Why are you doing this?
I saw this tweet from somebody that was saying, when I was 15, I couldn't understand my ancestors who left the most advanced civilizations in the world, got on this rickety boat, sailed, all this distance across the ocean, got on a wagon and crossed all this distance on the prairie, got into a like cabin in the middle of nowhere. It's like now that I'm 35, I get it.
Absolutely. That's my dream. If I could ever make that happen, got to pay some bills off first because the tax man's got to take his cut of everything.
Yes. Well, and speaking of that, this is something to go back to the country thing. One of my uncles said to me when I was pretty young, I was asking him something about taxes. I can't remember what I asked, but he said, son, taxes are what country folk pay to city folk so they don't kill us.
Okay, I might steal that at some point, but okay.
And
So
so that's in one of my books.
I appreciate that. So when did you get into, like, obviously you didn't just wake up one day and say, hey, I want to be an author. I'm going to assume you like to read at one point before you started. So how did that start for you? Like, what was your nerd journey?
Good question. Well, it didn't start with fantasy, though. It kind of did, actually, now that I think about it. It wouldn't have been called fantasy at the time. But it's this old, long poem. Oh, good Lord. If I can remember the name now. Oh, it's killing me. It's not Frost. It's not Robbie Burns. It's about this guy who's in the sort of Arctic, and it's this.
Right on the marge of Lake Lamarge where cremated Sam McGee.
The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. There we go. That was the sort of first thing that I remember, and probably my dad reading it to me or whatever. But I got into poetry, things that I could sort of read a bit easier. But eventually, I graduated to detective novels, stuff like that. But I remember reading my first fantasy book. It had a unicorn in it. I don't. Maybe it was like the last unicorn. I don't remember. But as soon as that happened, I was hooked. I got my hands on old D&D novels, Salvatore. I never know how to say his name. And then just anything and everything at that point. So lifelong fantasy fan. I don't know how old I would have been, but probably 9 or 10, and just a huge voracious reader. I didn't really think of myself as ever being an author or anything like that. I just loved the genre.
Now, when you were done reading, did you ever keep the story going on in your head about what happens when the last page is done and tell more of the story? I always do that, and I would shamelessly self-insert myself there where I was always the hero.
Yeah, of course, we all did that. And at some point, just like almost every other Western author in the world, I played Dungeons and Dragons, and I was usually a DM, and so I did that sort of thing. But I'm a proper nerd. My brother played BattleTech. I have an older brother. All these classic board games. What do you call it? Dawn of War, Warhammer, all that stuff.
Okay. Did you start with the reading it, or was it on the screen for you before you were reading? I
No,
don't know.
no. Yeah, I'm too old. I'm too old. It started as reading. The first screens I saw was like, the little blipping bars that knocked balls back and of course for a screen. Commodore 64, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, that was my first computer. It's Commodore
Yeah.
64.
Yeah, so that's you couldn't really play elaborate games when you're blazing on some BBC somewhere.
You had
Sure.
Baldur's Dash, and Frogger.
Yeah, with your 2800 modem or whatever.
Back when we sacrificed robots to get online.
Yeah. So no, it was definitely reading, but as times progressed, I definitely got into video games and everything else too. But I didn't become a writer. At some point, I knew I wanted to do it. At university age, I was taking English courses, taking writing courses, because of course I wanted to be broke for the rest of my life. And eventually, I thought, no, I don't want to be like a poet or something, which is what I thought at first. I want to write books. But of course, I had no idea how to do that. And so I went and got a proper job in an insurance business, actually, where I was there for several years, worked my way up to a sort of middle management position. But as the money started getting better and better, and I sort of saw my future projected out 20, 30 years, I thought, okay, it's now or never. And I quit my job, no safety net, nothing, and just started writing what became Kings of Paradise and eventually Ash and Sand. It took me 2 years to write a book, so I just saved up money. I had no kids at this point, and I literally did nothing but write this book for 2 years.
That's dedication.
Yeah. And insane, and not advisable for anybody out there who wants to become.
And I can't. I just imagine you telling your wife that. That would be like, well, see, honey, what happened was.
Well, she was my girlfriend at the time, and so we sort of joked because when she was first dating me, I was a dude in a suit who went downtown and made like low six-figure salary, and then I quit my job to be a writer. So she was. You've got a good woman when she marries you when you're like that.
At least you had the suit for the wedding already from your previous job. You're right.
That's right. So I published Kings of Paradise, 2 years later. I don't know if you want to talk about the self-publishing journey or not.
No, I don't care.
To more or less crickets, and I didn't expect much else. And I had to do a lot of work to get it pushed, trying to get reviewers, to get somebody to pay attention. And I eventually did get that sort of 0 to 1, where I got someone with a bit of a platform to pay attention to it. She ended up loving it. So she pushed it, and then it got me into the hands of a bunch of other reviewers. It kind of spiraled and snowballed a little bit from that. Plus, I entered this self-published Spiffbo contest. And so I got a bit more notoriety with that. At which point, the series made enough money to at least justify my existence a little bit. And so I was able to keep writing after that.
Nice. So when it comes to like with the writing, did you start straight with the first novel, or did you start with short stories? Did you try to write the epic poem? Because I tried to write an epic poem in high school. It was horrific. I hope my mom does not keep a copy. I read the Epic of Gilgamesh and I read Beowulf, and I'm like, I could do that.
Yeah, why not?
Why not? All you gotta do is have it like not get burned over the centuries, and eventually it'll be a classic just for a living.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, most writers die in poverty before they become famous. I basically just dove in head first.
Okay.
I had written short stories, like in sort of university era, but this was 10 years before I decided to write my first book. Okay. So I had written stuff, but many years before this. I'd never tried to write a novel. I didn't really know what I was going to do. The start of this series was sort of history inspired, but it was really two characters from vastly different cultures who would be clashing. That was really the only thing that I knew.
Okay. Since we started talking about the books, we're going to pause for a moment while we shamelessly chauffeur the man, and then when we come back, we'll just dive right in.
Sounds good.
The necromantic magic of the Great Lich has held sway over the world for 100 years. Can a young knight of the god of death and the last priestess of the goddess of life destroy him before their homeland falls? The only survivor of his convoy, journeyman knight Darian, is entrusted with an ancient scroll and one mission. Return the scroll to the High Temple in Hothan, no matter the cost. He never expected that journey to include stumbling onto the last healer in the world. Now he must take not only the scroll but the woman across the kingdom to safety, each step dogged by the relentless undead. Death's Knight, Book 1 in the completed War of the Lich series by Matthew T. Summers and Jenna Ray.
All right. Thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. So, with that out of the way, how did you come up with the idea for what became the Ash and Sand Trilogy? Like, where did the premise for this start? And while you answer that, I will go ahead and throw that cover up.
Sure. Well, it's sort of often a question that writers dread, sort of like, where do you get your ideas? But I I did at least have a few things in mind, and one was the cultural difference. I wanted one that was sort of more barbarian, somebody that's come out of the desert or the mountains, or culture like that. And then I wanted a culture that was much more decadent, much more familiar to a modern reader, with technology and wealth, and where people are sort of more comfortable. And so the series is called Ash and Sand because there's sort of the land of ash, which is the more uh, sort of Viking-esque with a couple of twists, um, sort of culture and situation, which is very frozen, difficult environment full of very hard people and difficult lives. And then there's the ash of the land of sand, which is I call Shrikon, which is sort of Southeast Asian in origin a little bit. This island chain that's just off a larger continent, and uh, sort of much richer, much nicer place where children don't freeze to death, and they don't refrain from naming their children before they're 5 or 6 years old because they die so often. These sorts of things. So it was really the clash and the mix of those two cultures, and what would happen when they encountered one another, and the characters who were the sort of avatars of each of these cultures when they met, and all of the history between them that's much more complicated than they know. And then it also moves into asking, because these two characters from these two cultures both find magic sort of at the same time, and so they're able to change this world from what it is. And the point of the series is really asking, what can power accomplish? If you suddenly gain all these magic powers and the world is one way, can you change it to make it a different way? Can any one individual, what are the ramifications of that? And sort of exploring the complexity in a kind of a Game of Thrones like way.
Now, you used, according to Amazon, this is classified as Asian-inspired myth and lore as one of the subgenres. Was this inspired by just your exposure to Asian culture? Because obviously your girlfriend at the time was Filipino, so you would be being exposed to her culture. Was it more like the Last Samurai kind of vibe, where that or the Ronin story, which a lot of Western audiences would be familiar with?
There's a little of both. So my favorite novel that wasn't fantasy was Shogun by James Clavell. And
Yeah.
I really love the story of this sort of British pilot or Dutch pilot, depending on how you want to describe him, washing up on the shores of Japan, being in this alien world. So there's an aspect of that in this story. You can, even on the cover, you see this sort of ship sailing up onto this sandy beach, right? So it's this sort of Viking culture. One character in particular who arrives in this new world, he doesn't know it exists. He's never seen anything but his own continent, and so it's this sort of amazing new experience for him. Having said that, it's not Japanese inspired. It's much more sort of somewhat Southeast Asian, but there's also some Polynesian. I use some of the Polynesian sort of themed gods of the sea and the sky and so on. But yes, there's some Filipino things that are part of the culture of these islanders that I literally plucked right out of sort of old Filipino culture. There's some Tagalog in there, things like that.
I mean, hey, you've got the exposure to it sitting in your living room. Why not tap the mind? Like I would do the
Yeah,
same thing.
yeah, absolutely.
I always joke that you could tell where I'm writing from because, like, sometimes where I'm writing a scene and everyone's name, if you break it down, is like coffee related from the various types of coffee. If you look at it, I'm like, because I was writing in a coffee shop and I was looking at the signs on the walls and I needed a name. So I get the urge to just go with what's next to you.
Yeah.
When you said that it was Viking inspired, do you just mean that they are ocean bound traders and warriors, or do you literally mean like the Norse Vikings?
So they are not sailors. That part they don't have. What they do have is a kind of hard warrior culture. It's very so the twist on these people is that they, despite having this very hard warrior culture, it's actually a matriarch. It's a matriarchal culture, and I actually copied a real life matriarchal culture in history called the Minning Tabal, which basically how it works is the men still do all the things that stereotypically men will do in a cult. They're still the farmers, they're still the warriors, they're even still the chiefs, but ostensibly they're doing everything on behalf of their wives, their mothers, and some sort of religious female figure, sort of like a figurehead, who sits atop a kind of religious hierarchy. And so in this world, there's these priestesses, essentially. There's this Galdric order with these priestesses who are more or less in charge of the law. The men are in charge of applying the law and punishing and so on. And so I play with the gender roles a little bit. I play with the conflict and the tension there between these very powerful men who do much of the real world work, and yet who are under the rules, at least, of some of these very powerful women. And of course, only the top tier men in this culture benefit. There's a huge underclass of men who don't get wives, who are sort of relegated to the bottom tiers of society and are held down and are always kind of on the cusp of rebellion. And so there's a great deal of fighting, there's a great deal of bloodshed, and it's a difficult environment. So they're very motivated, shall we say, to escape this environment, but they don't know that there's anything else out there.
Okay, so when it came to this story, did you start with the cultures and the people, or did you start with the plot ideas that you wanted the clash of those of two cultures that led to X, Y, or Z?
Yeah, well, yes and no, and I haven't mentioned the characters, but um, at some point, one character in particular, Ruka, who is from this land of ash, began to take over the story and also my life and brain probably for about 2 years. Um, he's this deformed sort of genius who lives in this terrible place. And by sort of the laws of the land, he should have been discarded when he was young, but his mother, who's kind of a prominent woman, saves him and takes him away. And so the story of that culture, it really becomes a coming of age story, if we want to talk about the plot. It's really a coming of age story of that character in that world, and who this character of Ruka is. And he has this sort of eidetic memory, but in a fantasy way, where he can literally remember his own birth all the way until he's older and can learn the words and so on. And so it's the story of his rise in this culture and how he changes it. And on the other hand, it's the story of a character named Kale, who's the son of a king. And he's the fourth son, so he's kind of an unimportant prince. But it's also his coming of age story. And so this plot is really the rise of these two characters from these two cultures who eventually meet, who eventually clash, and it's with all of the ramifications that come about.
Okay, now are the other story, like, obviously this trilogy is out there, and then you have the Beyond the Ash and Sea, which is a follow-on series. Are the other stories that you've got out there, the God Chronicles, are they all in the same world?
The God King Chronicles are not, technically speaking. I can't really say much about it because it's kind of spoiler territory. Beyond Ash and Sand is in the same world. Some of the characters make a reappearance, and you can absolutely you could read the Ash and Sand trilogy and then move on, or you can actually read Dark Sea's End on its own. It doesn't have to be read after the trilogy.
Okay. This is the second cover, which is why I asked about the Vikings with the boat looking. It looks like they're building a boat here.
Yeah. So if you've seen this television series, is it called Vikings? I think it is.
Yeah.
Ragnar Lothbrok and so on. Imagine this character of Ruka. He's kind of like Floki,
Okay.
mixed with Ragnar's brother or something. He's kind of a warrior, but he's also a genius. He invents new things to this culture, and one of the things he does is more or less figure out how to sail away from this land.
Okay. Now, you did mention that some of the ash and sand. So there's obviously a desert culture involved. Do they come up with something along? Because you've got magic. So do you come up with some of the concepts you see in fantasy where you've almost got boats that sail through the sand, though? More.
No, the sand people. They're actually, it's like desert, or not desert. It's island sand. It's like white, beautiful beaches.
Okay.
So
Because I'm just thinking, like, if you put skids on it or treads like you would to ski, you could rig up wind sails and potentially build sand boats.
That's true, but no, it's not. It's not like a desert themed. It's sort of like a seafaring islander sort of culture, like Polynesian with their various boats and so on.
Okay. You said there's magic in this world. How prominent is the magic? Like, is this something everyone knows about? It just happens in the background?
No, it's very sort of real world mythology style magic. It's a bit
Okay.
like Game of Thrones. It's the sophisticated people, particularly in the more advanced sort of society. If you talk about magic, people might think you're either a sort of peasant or a commoner or an idiot. It's sort of like gruntkins and elves. They don't think of magic. They might, on the other hand, they have gods and they do believe in the effect and power of gods on the natural world, but they don't think that human beings have any kind of magic powers, with one or two exceptions. They sort of think that their king is some kind of a sorcerer. So the nobles can exploit sort of that, but it is not a common thing. It's not well understood. In the less sophisticated society across the sea, it's much more seen as part of a natural order of things where they think that gods have much more impact on the day-to-day lives of normal people.
So how involved are the gods? Is it just something they worship? Is there in the background, or are they taking active roles a la Greek mythology where Zeus is just, boning everything and changing things?
I like to leave a bit of subtlety and gray area, but for the most part, you don't see any of the actual magic that people believe in. It's all discussed as mythology. It's all there in the background, but there's no evidence that it's true. Let's put it that way. Right up until there is, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So would you consider the cultures superstitious then, or are they more trying to find the science of things?
They're absolutely superstitious. There are, of course, people in the cultures who are sort of natural philosophers. There's one character in particular who's like that, and Ruka from this from this Viking culture, he's sort of like a budding scientist, but he's not from a culture of it. People are very, very superstitious, and so that has to be overcome more or less by anyone who wants to actually understand reality in this setting.
Okay. So what can you tell us about the main characters?
Well, we talked a little bit about Ruka. As I say, he's this sort of, his origin story. This isn't really a spoiler because it's on page 1. We're introduced to Ruka as he's eating somebody.
That's different. Okay, go on.
Because he's an outcast in this land, and he's literally sort of starving to death. And his solution has been to have to kill someone and eat them. It's not like he's a happy cannibal. It's a privation. It's a sort of, that's the situation he finds himself in, because he's been made an outcast by the society, which is more or less a death sentence, and he's young and he's sort of having to fight his way up from the absolute bottom of society. It's coming of age, but it's also a bit of a revenge story. He hates the society that has destroyed his life, and so he's after this particular priestess. His mother raised him and sort of told him that he was something special and that he could do something with his life. And so he uses the mythology of these people against them, if that makes sense, and sort of tries to build himself up into this mythological coming of a kind of prophet. And that's kind of his story on his own. Whereas Kale's story on the other land, he's this sort of wastrel prince. He's not living up to his father's expectations. He's kicked into the sort of Marines to toughen him up, to make something useful out of him. And so his story is, can he become useful? There's a bit of romance in his story where he has this kind of childhood lover who's sent from another nation as a kind of ward or polite prisoner. And so his story is coming of age and becoming a man, fundamentally. But both stories are these kind of unstoppable force characters that are in this parallel path that eventually leads them into a unstoppable clash, let's say, between these two cultures that you can sense building throughout the story.
Okay, so with the main characters, how it ultimately, like, if you're having the clash of characters, do they meet because they're fighting each other, or do they become unintentional allies? Like, what is this? Is this kind of a team building story, or
this is deep spoiler territory? So I have to be a little careful.
Absolutely, because we want people to read the book. We don't want to give them reason not to. But
basically, what seems like unrelated stories and unrelated areas are deeply intermixed.
Okay.
And so the history and the mystery of these two places is sort of revealed throughout the stories. And it's a tale sort of as old as time. What happens when European settlers land in the New World, right? What happens when the barbarian people enter the city? So we know it's going to be bloody. We know it's going to be unpleasant. And the question becomes, who comes out on top? Can they get along? Can they make a deal? Can they, what's going to happen when these characters and civilizations meet, fundamentally?
Well, Disney taught us the answer to that. There will be much singing.
Yeah. Well, there's not much singing.
Except for the singing of blades. Yeah. So did you lean into, because obviously you were writing this pre-COVID, so viruses weren't on everyone's mind, but if you were as interested in history as I am, then you realize that when cultures that have never met meet each other, oftentimes they're exposing each other to bugs that the other, and I say that bug isn't like bacteria and viruses, that they culturally haven't built up immunities to. So do you throw some of that in there? Because that's very real on both ends.
Absolutely. I don't really dig into it too deeply because it's almost too dark, if that makes sense.
It does.
It's already a pretty dark story in some ways, and the reality of showing the actual truth of the disease in such situations is sort of so terrible that there's not much good fiction that can come out of it. But I absolutely include a little bit of it, and I show that it's a big thing to some of the main characters. So yeah, it's in there for sure.
So what would be the age range of a target reader for you?
This is always tricky because when I wrote this story, I thought of it as historical more than dark. But once it came out, people were like, "Oh my God, this is grimdark," And so I never want to say what a reader's prepared for, but I would have fully expected, a 15, 16-year-old to be able to read this story and then obviously anyone older than that. So it should appeal to any sort of reasonably mature epic fantasy fan.
Okay, so viewer discretion advised, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Do you have, like, obviously we talked about the main characters. Do you have any favorite secondary characters?
I've got a lot. Yeah, there's quite a lot of secondary characters in this story. There's a couple of great warriors who make their appearances. Maybe one that I'll mention is a very interesting character just because of that barbarian sort of matriarchal situation where you have this great warrior who in most cultures, his name's Aiden, would be sort of a peerless, revered, Alexander the Great, or at the very least Achilles or something, sort of the greatest warrior of his time. But in this culture, he's sort of degraded on purpose because the especially the feminine aspect, but the culture in general is afraid of any one man rising too high and sort of becoming a king. And so he's this unbelievably impressive, competent character, but he's kind of held back on purpose by this culture because they're afraid of him becoming a Julius Caesar or something, right? And so he is, you can see the injustice of his situation, and you can see the pull and the readiness for a character like that to upend his civilization. It's a weak culture fundamentally that holds a man down like that because he's ready to turn on you, if that makes sense. Uh-oh, did I lose you?
Nope, I just muted myself because I was opening a can of Diet Coke and I forgot to unmute it. So obviously, like, one of the defining facets of medieval life is when we think about it, we definitely think about the castles and the swords and the shields and whatnot. So what level of tech outside of the magic are these characters engaging with? Are we talking spears and axes, swords and shields and armor? Like, what can we expect?
Yeah, there's a range somewhat because there's a continent with a whole bunch of cultures on this sort of across the sea here, but it's very much an Iron Age culture. So you've got swords, shields. The main character Ruka, he becomes a bit of he's not just builds ships, he also builds sort of new armor. So he sort of creates a technological advance there. Technology is definitely a big part of this series, and you see the clash of it between these cultures. There's also military technologies, and some of them are sort of trained heavy infantry in a style that a Greek or a Roman would sort of understand, and some of them are more classic sort of Norse shield wall type fighting. There is definitely some big battles that happens in the series. There's a huge siege that happens later in the series. So my historical knowledge is useful there.
Okay. What can you tell us about the bad guy of this universe without spoilers, obviously?
Tricky. Well,
and if you can't answer that because of spoilers, then we totally get that.
Yeah, I can. Because it is sort of a Game of Thrones style story, there's no true, with one exception, there's no true, like, this is obviously the villain. Ruka's story, for sure, comes across as, at the very least, anti-hero. Many readers think of him as a sort of unfortunate, empathizable villain, at least at the start of the series or at the start of the first book or somewhere in the first book. And then by the end of the series, they're not sure. So I play with that. I don't make it obvious who the winner is going to be or who the villain is and who you should be cheering for. But there are more villainous characters. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Would you live in this world if you could?
Sorry, I'm dying over here. Would I live in this world?
It's allergy season. I get it.
Yeah. Ideally not. No, I wouldn't. It's very interesting to visit, but I don't think most people would like to live in an Iron Age technology world if they really knew what it was like and had the choice.
Yeah, I mean, plot armor's a thing for a reason.
Yes. When you died of some diphtheria or something, you wouldn't really approve of that.
Yeah, that's always been one of my complaints about the people that write post-apoc. Like, nobody's getting sick of like a cut, got infected, and you died crossing the, I mean, like not Game of Thrones, Oregon Trail. I don't know if you in Canada played that as a school kid.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
So that game taught me the realities of harshness of that, because I kept dying crossing the river. I'd get infected or dysentery or whatever.
Yep.
And so that's one of the things nobody really factors into both fantasy without explicit magical healing or post-apocalyptic. Like, how are they not getting sick from everything?
Well, it's, as I think we learned probably in Game of Thrones with Khal Drogo, even if it's done exceptionally well, it's kind of a letdown. If a character dies of illness, you're like, oh man, like really? It's just not dramatic. It's not. It's too realistic. It's very difficult to do in fiction.
Yeah, and that's one of the things you run into with like the missed opportunity with Firefly when they killed Wash, right? Like, you want to make the death matter. Like, I get it. Life is capricious. Yeah. Sometimes people are just right place, wrong time, boom, struck by lightning, hit by a car, whatever.
Yeah.
But if you're going to do that, like, do it to a non-main character. If you're going to kill a main character, give them the dignity of a good death.
Yeah, it's
or a bad death, but one that means something.
That's right. It's really, really hard to do. And yeah, it has to be something, again, with sickness, it tends to be slow too. And so that makes it extremely hard to do it, because if you want to have a shock value death, it has to be, Red Wedding, right?
Yeah. So obviously this is a trilogy, because we said that, and that's how it's listed on Amazon. Are you planning on revisiting the main Ash and Sand series, or is the continuation in the Beyond series?
Yeah, it'll be continued in Beyond Ash and Sand, which there's one book out, and it'll be a trilogy as well.
Okay. So if people wanted to, wait, before I do that, this is the part, dear listener, where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right books. So do your part, people. It really does make a difference. And with that out of the way, is there anything we didn't ask about this series that you think people need to know before we wrap this up?
I'll say it's a big, dark, deep series. You need to take your time reading it. It's not like some of the sort of more shallow fantasy that you get these days in most of the fantasy aisles. It's sort of a return to the classics. So whether you like that or not is up to you. You're not going to finish reading this series in 2 days or 3 days. It's probably going to take you a few weeks, but it's absolutely painstakingly written over a few years. It's a return to classic fantasy. You will be able to dive in deep and get lost, and there's not a lot of fantasy left like that, so that's why I wrote it.
So I did check, because I do tend to do my reading with my ears. There are audiobooks, but it's listed as unabridged. I don't think I've ever seen that. Is that because you've done revisions, like edits? Why is the audiobook current?
Yes, yeah, it's current. And actually, now that you mention that, it's sort of a story. I mentioned my favorite book was Shogun by James Clavell. The fellow who narrated that book was a guy named Ralph Lister. And he's a British actor, has done a number of things. I think he was in one Marvel movie too, as a minor character. And I randomly just decided to email him and ask him if he'd be interested in doing the narration for this trilogy. And he agreed. So I got the narrator of Shogun to do this series.
Nice.
Yeah.
Hopefully he didn't break the bank, because narration done right is not free and not cheap.
It was not cheap, but he actually read the books and he enjoyed them so much that we agreed to do sort of a split profit deal. So I didn't, that was sort of how we did it.
Nice. Okay. So with that out of the way, if people wanted to check you out on the wild interwebs and stalk you as you do to authors you like, how might they find you?
Well, I think you had some links up for me. They can find me on Twitter. I have a website.
And all that will be in the show notes.
Awesome. They can find my website. It's my name. If they just Google Richard Nell, I'll pop up. I'm on Goodreads. I'm on Reddit, if you're a fan there. That's pretty much it.
Okay. When I know okay. One of the things that affects if you're doing classic fantasy, the more is the length, right? So they take longer to write. Is this, Brandon Sanderson level size, or is it more in keeping with the modern sensibilities, about 100,000 words?
It's somewhere in between. I worked out that it's a little bit longer than the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Wow. Okay.
Yes. The second book is 220,000 words.
Did you make up a language too? Are you holding out on us?
I did not do that. No. I'm more of the tip of the iceberg type of writer. I don't show you. I don't have the whole iceberg.
Okay. All right. And all of his links will be in the show note, dear listener. You can find us on our Linktree, linktr.ee, Linktree/Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, Linktree/Blasters and Blades Podcast, where we link to all the things, the BitChutes, the Rumbles, the YouTubes, the TikToks, the Twitters. We've got our Spotify, our Discord, our Blasters and Blades Facebook group and Facebook page. You can email the show at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. For professional purposes only, people. Save the shenanigans from Madam Stabby Stab over there on the Instagram, the Twitter, and the email. You can support the show by going to buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that is for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink that coffee brand coffee till they float away on a river of Java goodness. And if you use the links in the show note for Coffee Brand Coffee and the code podcast grunts, you get 10% off. We get a little bit of a kickback. It's a win-win, people. So that really does help us keep the lights on. And with that, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades Podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. And with that, thanks for coming on, Richard. This was a lot of fun. And I'm definitely going to have to go check that out when I get my next Audible credit.
Hey, my pleasure, man. Thanks for having me on.
With that, we're going to hit the end button. Wait for